All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Grüezi miteinander. A warm welcome as well to our online viewership and to Ambassador Pitulu. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stan Voiger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to introduce this event on the state of U.S. Swiss relations, co-hosted by the American Swiss Foundation. The U.S. and Switzerland have maintained diplomatic relations since the formation of the Swiss Confederation in the mid-19th century. For the next 45 minutes, I'll go through the history of the bilateral relationship, which remains strong today and is characterized by cooperation among many different domains on the basis of shared values and long-standing cultural, economic, and personal ties. Speaking of personal ties, my godmother and her family are longtime residents of Switzerland. I have not been to visit in Schwyz for quite some time, so I hope introducing this event compensates for that to some extent, probably not. Anyway, today's discussion will focus on how and where the bilateral relationship can be strengthened and deepened. We'll also touch on a few areas where the U.S. may be able to learn from the Swiss model of governance. Perhaps most saliently in the latter category, the recent shenanigans around the debt limit and the Congress's continued inability to return the U.S. to a sustainable fiscal trajectory illustrate that inspiration from a country with a debt to GDP ratio well below 50% is perhaps more than welcome. Switzerland and the US, in fact, both organize tax collection, government spending in a relatively decentralized manner compared to other advanced economies. Switzerland, therefore, I think has particularly relevant lessons to offer. Now, turning to the shared interests of our two countries, Switzerland and the US, first and foremost, have an important economic relationship. Something I'm sure that will come up in today's conversation is whether that relationship should be strengthened through a full-fledged free trade agreement. In these times when talk of decoupling and friendshoring sometimes feels like a justification for old-school protectionism, a push along those lines would, I think, both be refreshing and reassuring. The U.S. also has been a key proponent of the 2019 OECD Global Corporate Tax Deal. That deal would introduce a global minimum tax. Swiss voters will decide in a referendum less than 2 weeks from now whether to amend the Swiss constitution in order to implement the agreement. Not clear, of course, the U.S. itself will manage to do so, but I'd be interested in hearing thoughts on that. The relationship is, of course, not just an economic one. Despite its tradition of neutrality, Switzerland has supported Ukraine as it defends itself from Russia's war of aggression through the implementation of economic, financial, and other sanctions. I'll be curious to hear from our speakers how the U.S. and Switzerland can deepen their relationship as it relates to this and other foreign policy objectives. With that, let me, in fact, introduce our speakers. First, to your right, we have Robert Giuffra, chair of the American Swiss Foundation since 2016. He is also co-chair of Sullivan & Cromwell, a major law firm and a partner in the firm's litigation group. Here in DC, has served in all three branches of the federal government, as a law clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist, as chief counsel of the Senate Banking Committee, and in the Reagan White House. My colleague, Rob Portman, is a distinguished visiting fellow in the practice of public policy here at AEI. His career in public service, distinguished indeed, includes 6 terms in the House of Representatives, 2 in the Senate, representing his home state of Ohio. He also served in 3 presidential administrations, I hope I'm getting the numbers right here, including as OMB director, and as U.S. Trade Representative. But most importantly, for today's purposes, he is a co-founder of the Congressional Swiss Caucus and a former co-chair. Now, run of show, very straightforward. Mr. Giuffra will moderate a conversation with Senator Portman on various aspects of today's topic. The conversation will involve all of you as well through Q&A, so start thinking about good questions that ideally end with a question mark. For our online viewers, please submit your questions to roberto.diaz@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. Conversation will be followed by reception. I hope you'll all be able to stick around for that. With that, let me welcome our speakers, Senator Portman, Mr. Giuffra.
Thank you, Sam.
A round of applause, maybe.
Stan, thank you so much. And it's a real privilege for the American Swiss Foundation to partner with AEI. AEI is really one of the great think tanks in the United States. And, Switzerland is a country where I really think the country really gets a lot right. And if you look at surveys of, on various metrics, whether it be healthcare, economic development, innovation, Switzerland also often comes out #1. And in fact, on some surveys, Switzerland is deemed to be the happiest country in the world. So I always say that we can learn a lot from our Swiss friends. The American Swiss Foundation was founded right after World War II, literally within days of VE Day in New York City. And our mission is to strengthen the ties between the sister republics. So, Senator, I want to, maybe we'll just start the question. I get to play William F. Buckley or something like that. You were born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, but you have some Swiss roots. So could you tell us about your Swiss roots?
Well, first of all, thank you to AEI for hosting this. And Bob, thank you for taking a lot of time out of your busy private life to be the chair of the American Swiss Foundation and all you do in that regard. You didn't mention the great work you do in developing young leaders, but there are now, as I understand it, several thousand people who have come through that process. 1,400
young leaders, and they consist of everyone from John Barrasso, who is, I guess, probably what, the number 2 or 3 senior Republican in the Senate.
Co-chair of the Swiss caucus now.
Now co-chair of the Swiss caucus.
Finally, they got a good co-chair.
These big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
We also have multiple members of Congress, CEOs, really a very impressive group of people who every year get to go to Switzerland. And the program was started by Faith Whittlesey, who you probably knew pretty well. And Faith had been ambassador to Switzerland not once but twice, and also was very close to President Reagan. And you probably worked. Did you ever work with Faith in the White House?
Yep.
Maybe tell us a little bit about Faith and you're working with Faith.
Yeah. Well, she was a force to be reckoned with and loved Switzerland. And she was the reason that I got involved in the foundation years ago. Also Mercer Reynolds from Cincinnati, who was ambassador briefly. But anyway, it's a great foundation because it helps young people to be able to understand Switzerland directly by sending them to Switzerland for an exchange program. But then these individuals end up in important positions in business and government and medicine and so on, and are able to even further deepen the great relationship we have with our sister republic. I also want to thank Ambassador Pieterloot for being here, the Swiss ambassador who has been a good friend of us in the Swiss caucus and in the Congress, and is always very frank with his relationships with the Congress, which I appreciate. Our relationship with Switzerland is terrific. We are so fortunate to have this deep relationship where we share so many values: democracy, human rights, an economic approach with free markets. And yet we now and again have differences. And you haven't been shy about raising those and addressing those, including with regard to Swiss neutrality as it relates to sanctions and Ukraine. So we can talk more about that later. But I want to thank you for being here and for your service. I call him.
He also speaks 7 languages for the Americans in the audience.
Yeah. Anyway, my Swiss connection is very simple. My family, the Portman family, came to Ohio in the late 1800s from Switzerland, and they came looking for opportunity, just like your family probably did. And my daughter, Sally Portman, has now arrived. My wife, Jane Portman, is here. And
I think Sally's going to be a young leader.
She's one of your young leaders.
It's a great trip. So this is an advertisement. Send your application in. Every year we take 25 Americans and 25 Swiss. All expenses paid.
Yeah, very competitive too, right?
No, it is actually. We get a lot of applications.
Anyway, the Portman family was in Switzerland during a period of a great recession in Europe, in Northern Europe, in the 1870s. And decided they wanted to join some of their countrymen in the United States of America. So they appealed to the burghers, to the local leaders in their little community of Ebbetsville, 400 people, and they said, well, we're willing to pay your passage to America. Frankly, they had 10 kids. I think they were happy to get the family moving along at a time of a recession and very few jobs. So I've taken my children there, as my father took me there. There's a plaque on the Portman house that my grandfather put there. But the burghers, being the community leaders, actually cut down a stand of trees to pay for their passage. And today you look up and there's, part of the trees are a little lower than others, and that's called the Americas stand. And so, again, like so many of you, all of you, I would dare say, you have a story like that, where penniless, they came to the United States. They had no money. They arrived in Ohio because that's where some of their countrymen were, working in dairy farms. The reason the Swiss were so happy is they eat a lot of cheese and eat a lot of chocolate. That's the happiness quotient. But so they were cheesemakers, and and they worked in the dairies, and eventually my great-grandfather, who came at age 11, actually became a medical doctor at Case, now Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. So that's our story in terms of the Swiss connection, and it's been a wonderful way to reconnect over time, again, with my family and my children. And you know, I'm just a big fan of Switzerland, and therefore, when I was U.S. Trade Representative, I spent some time in Switzerland, and that USTR has an office in Geneva, of course, where the UN headquarters are there, and where the U.S. You know, gets involved on the WTO issues. WTO is headquartered there, World Trade Organization, and you know, I wanted very badly to have a U.S. Swiss trade relationship that was deepened to the point that we could have a free trade agreement. Didn't happen, despite our efforts, but we did establish a basis for it, and I do believe, per the comments earlier, it would make a lot of sense. The biggest issue will be agriculture, as it usually is, and the Swiss sometimes protect their agriculture a little bit, but we can resolve that. In the meantime, there is a sectoral agreement recently on pharmaceutical manufacturing, as an example, and we're hoping to do other sectoral agreements with Switzerland to create a foundation for a free trade agreement. It would have two immediate benefits. One is Switzerland is a huge economic partner of the United States, and there are enormous investments.
Number 6 in direct investment, which is quite amazing when you think about it. And the jobs are, you know, fantastic.
High-paying jobs.
High-paying jobs, north of $100,000 per job.
At least 600,000, some say 750,000 Americans now work for Swiss companies. Ambassador can give us the latest on that. But it's a great economic relationship, and that could even be broadened and deepened with lower tariffs and with other arrangements on the services side in particular that would help the economies of both countries. Second, I think it would be a great template for a broader agreement with other countries in Europe, specifically with the EU itself, just as an agreement with the UK would be. So it could be a good opening in order to have the United States do what I think makes all the sense in the world, particularly with the competition from China, is to have an even stronger relationship with our European allies. So I'm not giving up, Ambassador, on the free trade agreement. This administration has decided not to pursue FTAs, free trade agreements, but as I said, they are at least doing these sectoral agreements that could, in the end, create this foundation for a broader agreement at some point.
What has been the sort of the holdup on getting the trade agreement done? I mean, they really tried in the last administration to get it done, and they weren't able to get it done.
Well, I'm looking at the ambassador because he was close to it. Agriculture is always a sticking point with Europe generally, and specifically with the Swiss. And so, you know, when we do a free trade agreement in the United States, we insist on lower tariffs, but also tariffs to zero at some point. And that's very difficult, I think, for some of the Swiss politicians and the Swiss farmers. So that's been one of the issues, is that agriculture isn't necessarily competitive, but it's a big part of the Swiss ethos and the Swiss tradition. And then second, just the specific issues around banking and around transparency and so on. We've worked through a lot of those issues, but that's one issue.
I mean, those issues have largely been cleaned up, as best I can tell.
I think so.
And in fact, you know, during the whole Ukraine situation, the Swiss were very good about U.S. sanctions and enforcing U.S. sanctions, much more so than would have happened 20 or 30 years ago.
I think that's true. There's still, I believe, some loopholes there. And as a friend of Switzerland, I will say that I think there's still some things we can work on, including the ability for lawyers to be protected in Switzerland if they have a relationship, say, with an oligarch, and are not required under Swiss law to be transparent about that. That's something that I think would be helpful. So I think it's not perfect yet, Bob. So there's more that can be done. But I agree with you. It's a big improvement from where we would have been if we had not gone through a lot of the reforms really back in the 2000s and over the last couple decades.
Tell us a little bit about the founding of the Swiss Congressional Caucus and what was the impetus behind it?
Well, Swiss parliamentarians came over to Congress and said they wanted to meet with a group of senators and Congress people, and so I was in the House at the time. We figured, what the heck, let's start a Swiss caucus. And so we did, and we welcomed them, and then it developed into a relationship on some of the issues we talked about today. The economic issues, of course, and the trade between our countries, but also on some of these policy issues. One thing that always fascinated me as a former OMB director, Office of Management and Budget, which you put out the president's budget every year as an example, and I was on the budget committee in the House as well, is the Swiss approach to debt. They have what's called the debt brake, and it's actually part of their constitution. And Stan said earlier, they're less than 50% of GDP on their debt. It's actually about 20% today. And when it was 30-some%, the Swiss thought, oh my gosh, this is so high. Now, relatively speaking, America is now over 100%. Our debt is 100% of our economic output, our GDP. When the Swiss were at 30-some, they were so nervous because they're Swiss and therefore fiscally conservative that they actually put forward a referendum which passed with 85% vote, as I recall, by the citizens of Switzerland saying, yeah, we want to put a debt brake in place where during a recession, during something like the pandemic, there can be some relief on that. But over time, you have to keep the debt to GDP number within this 20, 30% range. As a result, Switzerland has had enormous success fiscally. You think of where the UK is, over 100%, Japan over 100%, and yet Switzerland has strengthened their economy, and frankly, it enables them to have far lower interest rates when they go out to borrow, when they do need something. So it's worked out very well for the Swiss economic growth and for the citizens of Switzerland. So
well, one of the big issues the Swiss face is that the demand for the Swiss franc is so strong because it's such a strong currency that they've got to, they're very concerned about keeping it up at least a little bit because of the pressure. One of the things I've always thought is, Switzerland gets so many things right that maybe America can learn more from our sister republics. So why don't we just tick through some of the issues? I mean, in terms of fiscal policy, what do you think we can learn from the Swiss, and where are we making, a mistake, having recently passed the debt ceiling bill, for example?
Well, we went through in that, the machinations of that. I think we've done that now 70 times. It does put our economy at risk. The bottom line is, even though the agreement was necessary, and I'm so glad it was reached, it still didn't deal with the underlying issue, which is the debt. So again, over $30 trillion, over 100% of our GDP. We haven't been there since the year after World War II when we were able to immediately lower our defense spending and deal with it. So this is uncharted territory. And the Swiss, on the other hand, have taken this seriously and dealt with debt. And getting a constitutional amendment in the United States would be more difficult, frankly, than the Swiss process. It's easier to ratify in Switzerland. But we could certainly pass a law, at least, that has similar kinds of breaks to say, okay, when there is a recession or when there is something like the pandemic or a war, of course, there would be some flexibility, and that's what people would like to see. But otherwise, there would be constraints, much like a balanced budget would provide constraints that every state lives with, which you live with, businesses live with. So I think that's what we can learn, is that there may be a way legislatively to do this. There has been legislation introduced to do so. It hasn't caught on yet. But my hope is that as we see the potential consequences through this debt limit crisis we just went through, that we think, okay, there must be a better way to do this. And I think we can learn from Switzerland.
Now, do you miss serving on Capitol Hill, or do you like it much more in the sort of nice confines here at AEA?
I don't miss everything about the Senate, but I miss some things. And the main one, of course, is just policy making. And it's fun on the outside to be able to talk about all this stuff. It's a lot more fun to actually do it.
One of the big differences between the U.S. and Switzerland is the Swiss political system is, like everything Swiss, very moderate. And for example, you only serve as the president for 1 year, and no one really knows who the president is, and power is decentralized, and they have initiative and referendum, and voters can literally vote on issues. And I think the political system is one where it's really oriented toward reaching common ground, something that I think we've lost in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years. Do you even want to comment on sort of where we've gone wrong?
Yeah, I totally agree. One reason that the U.S. Swiss relationship is so strong is that we learned from them in our own constitution, and they learned from us in their constitution, and a lot of it was about this system of federalism. They have a unique federalist system, as we do, but there are a lot of similarities. Theirs is more
We
intensely.
actually got the idea of the federal system from the canton system.
Yeah.
And there was a speech that Justice Scalia gave probably 20 years ago at our dinner, and he went on and on about how
The Swiss informed us.
The Swiss informed us, and the idea of a written constitution was something that the Swiss took from the United States.
So we've got that back and forth. I started a center at the University of Cincinnati, my hometown university, where my congressional papers are, on this topic of how do we manage to find common ground again? Because I do think after 30 years in public service that that's one of the biggest problems that we face as a democracy, is that we are having a harder time solving big problems. Every force seems to push people to the outside, to the extreme. So whether it's how you raise money these days, which is largely online, to do so and to be effective, you really need to be throwing out the red meat. As I found out as I prepared for my election that I chose not to run again, as you know, but I realized if I did run again, I'd probably have to rely heavily on online fundraising. And so it's tough when you're out there, calling the other side all these terrible names, including the leaders of the other party, and then you arrive in Washington and it's sort of hard to work with people, right? Second is the way the primary system works and the primacy of the primaries now, and specifically the gerrymandering and the fact that a lot of districts are red or they're blue, and so the election is really the primary, which drives people, I think, another centrifugal force more to the left extreme or right extreme. And I think the media also is a huge problem today, and these are not easy to solve, but if you want to go on MSNBC or go on Fox and you don't want to talk about controversy, good luck, because that's kind of what drives their business model. And the same is true online, where people are going deeper and deeper into something that reaffirms their beliefs. And so all this is kind of pushing people out. The great middle is still there, by the way. Most Americans think we ought to work together and get stuff done. All the polling shows that. But you don't see that. There's a disconnect on the political side. So I think this is worth, one, teaching young people you can do it differently. You can, through civility and respect for others' points of view, and reach common ground. Even if you're a conservative or you're a liberal, it doesn't matter. The point is, you, at the end of the day, have to solve problems, or you should view your job that way. Again, just as you do in your families or businesses. So we're working on that at the University of Cincinnati. I'm looking forward to helping students think differently about public service. We'll be using our case studies like the infrastructure bill and other legislation that I passed over the last 3 decades. And second, we'll be hopefully being a national platform to talk more about this issue.
How do you think we can become more Swiss in our politics here in the United States?
Well, I think getting the great middle to speak up, getting more people to vote in primaries, I mean, that's an easy solution. Those of you in the room who don't vote in primaries, please engage, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Otherwise, you're leaving it up to a handful of people, not just to decide who wins the primary, but often who wins, therefore, the general election. So, and we'll see this play out in our presidential elections.
In terms of getting control of the national debt, obviously it involves dealing with entitlements. Why is it that, we basically have put entitlements almost off the table, even though that's the part of our budget that's sort of expanding, and even though people are living older, older and older?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do is to establish these parameters we talked about earlier. So you decide, what should the percent be of GDP? What's safe for our country fiscally? Once you have those parameters, much like a balanced budget, then you have to make hard trade-offs. And it's within, a relatively small amount of money on the domestic discretionary side now. It's only 30% of our spending is appropriated by Congress every year. 70% is on autopilot, which is the entitlements plus interest on the debt. And of that 30%, remember, more than half of that is military spending, defense spending. So you're left with a relatively small pot of money where there's a lot of fury and fire and a lot of discussion about it, and that's fine. But you're leaving the vast majority of the spending on an autopilot sort of a approach where there's really no serious consideration or oversight. So that has to change if we are going to survive as a country, because eventually this will, of course, bankrupt us. And everybody, I think, recognizes that. The difficulty is grabbing that third rail in the New York subway system, as they call the third rail, where you get electrified when you grab it, because the politics are difficult. And both President Biden and former President Trump have made it clear recently that we can't touch any of these programs, which of course is totally irresponsible and unsustainable. Otherwise, again, we'll go bankrupt. I think people will notice more, Bob, when we start to get closer to the period when we'll actually have to cut spending in those areas under current law. So within about 10 or 12 years, depending on the most recent forecast, Social Security will have to be cut by about 20 to 25%, unless the law changes. That's, because the trust fund is running out of money.
By the way.
Yeah.
That's when we'll be collecting.
Yeah. So I think what you do is you start with young people and you say, since it's unlikely that you feel like you're going to get your Social Security benefit anyway. I see some young people here in the audience who probably feel that way. Right, Matt? Yeah, okay, good. You said yes, sir, because you used to work for me, so you had to. And start with him and say, look, the longevity is increasing, thank goodness, in the United States, and so, you're going to get your Social Security, but you're not going to get it maybe at age 62. Maybe you have to wait a little while. So for people who are at or near retirement, it doesn't affect them, but it would affect future generations. And what you get in that trade-off is saving the system and ultimately saving the country. So I think those are the kinds of things you have to look at. I think means testing, which is, by the way, already built into all these programs, Medicare, Social Security, as an example, needs to be increased as well. And I think people recognize that. So I think there are things that can be changed. There are dials that can be turned. The question is, do you have the political will to take this on? And again, I think it's probably most helpful to have some sort of construct where you say, okay, we have to do it because we have to meet these Swiss debt break type requirements or a balanced budget type requirement. And what are the priorities? How are we going to prioritize the spending, and how are we going to move the country forward? If we don't do it, again, the future of the young people in this room, will be affected very substantially. At some point, there'll be a financial crisis if we don't deal with it.
Let's talk about education. We spend in the United States billions of dollars on education. And I think there's been a view, that maybe our system isn't all that great. And we have a real problem with people in poverty and not being able to get out of poverty. The Swiss have a very strong apprenticeship model where you don't have to go to college. You're actually taught a trade, you can get a really good paying job. Do you think that there's a place in the United States for the Swiss apprenticeship model? And since it makes so much sense, why haven't we adopted it writ large?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's another example where we can learn from the Swiss, isn't it? And I think you've described it really well, Bob. I think we need a whole paradigm shift here. And I'm looking at a room full of college graduates, and that's great. One is my daughter. But we need to shift away from college focus exclusively to a much bigger focus on skills training, particularly for the so-called middle skills, as economists call them, because we're just, we don't have enough welders, we don't have enough machinists, we don't have enough coders, we don't have enough hospital techs, we don't have enough truck drivers. We badly need more people in the workforce generally, but specifically in these kinds of jobs. And these are good paying jobs, and you don't need a college degree to do these jobs. You do need some training. One of the bills I think would make a lot of sense, would be consistent with the Swiss approach, is to say, instead of allowing Pell Grants to be used for college, why not allow Pels also to be used for training? So that's a paradigm shift where we're saying as a country, yeah, we value college for those who want to go to college, and it's appropriate for them to go to college and again, become great scientists and engineers and so on. That's important also. But for many Americans, it would be much better for them to get the skills training. Right now, fewer than half of American young people do go to college, by the way, and yet the skills training is not available. It's not fair, in my view. So I go to a welding class at a CTE, Career and Technical Education program in Ohio, which is high school skills training, which I think is a great program. And Ohio's got one of the best CTE programs. I meet a young woman who's a welder, and she's here with 15 guys who are in the welding class and her. And when I speak to her about her future, she says, "Yeah, I'd like to improve my welding skills. Ultimately, I'd like to become, an underwater welder, which is like at the top of the list. Like that. Then you can do on oil rigs and places like that, and they make a lot of money." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do next year?" She's a senior. She said, "Well, I'm going to the local college." I said, "Why?" She goes, "Because I can get a Pell. Because my family qualifies for a Pell, and I can get a Pell to go to college, but I could never afford these welding courses. And they're expensive." And so if she were offered the opportunity to use that Pell for her training course, a 15-week training course in welding, she would take it in a minute. And it'd be better for her and better for our country. And so I'm a big fan of Pell Grants. I will say, of the kids that go to college with Pell, fewer than half get a degree. So a lot end up, because they have other expenses as well, other than tuition might be covered by Pell. They, again, fewer than half find that degree and end up back in the workforce, but without a skill to be able to take advantage of the economic opportunities that are out there. So I think it needs a paradigm shift, and I think the Swiss, again, are giving us an opportunity here to look at another model. Apprenticeship, yes, but more broadly speaking, how do we focus as a country more on skills training for the jobs that are actually out there that are needed?
One other area where I think the Swiss do really well is on healthcare. The Swiss healthcare system seems to be, it's an insurance-based system, and it seems to work a lot better than the U.S. system. Is that another example of the Swiss sort of doing things smart in a way that America, maybe we're not? We have too much politics that is sort of driving our decision-making?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the Swiss healthcare system to be able to comment on it. I will say that the Swiss make it more of an economic decision, so that the Swiss patients know the cost of what they're receiving from the hospital, from the doctor. And to me, that's the fundamental basis of a better healthcare system, is to have transparency and know what the costs are and treat healthcare more like other aspects of our economy. Healthcare is different, I understand that. And in certain instances, the expenditures are absolutely necessary. But in many cases, without competition, without transparency, it's hard to get the healthcare costs under control. And I think the Swiss have done a good job on that. Would you agree, Ambassador?
We have our troubles too.
Yeah, that's why I like him. He's candid.
Why don't we shift to foreign affairs for a second? Obviously, the war in Ukraine has sent a clear message to the West that democracy is at least under some threat. How have the U.S. and Switzerland worked together, during the whole Ukraine matter or war?
Well, first of all, we have a strong relationship with Switzerland on many levels, and one is at the diplomatic level and foreign policy level. As an example, they've been very helpful with Iran over the years as a country that is able to access some of these countries with which we do not have a relationship, and yet, the Swiss have a reputation for directness and honesty, and sometimes being able to solve problems that we simply can't solve on our own. So we thank them for that. On Ukraine, they have been supportive. Last year, I believe it's true, that the Swiss spent about $8 billion on American F-35s and Patriot missile systems. So the Swiss have also decided, to be interoperable with NATO and us. And now they're not members of NATO. They are a neutral country. I don't want to overstep my bounds here. But on the other hand, I respect the fact that they have chosen to be on our side during what is increasingly a two-sided world. And the war in Ukraine has accelerated that. I think it was already headed that way. So you have China and Iran and North Korea and Russia. But the free world needs to stand up and be counted. And Switzerland has not been hesitant to do that by having the Patriot missile systems, the F-35s, and by providing assistance to Ukraine appropriately, not lethal because of the neutrality issues, but other support. And then the sanctions as well. And I said there's some improvement, I think, that can be made on the sanctions front that we can get into in more detail if you like. But I think it's really important that the Swiss continue to take this position that in this bipolar world we have, where you have increasingly the non-democratic and the autocratic approach and incredibly brutal, unprovoked, illegal war against Ukraine, and you have the free world having to step up. Switzerland wants to be on the side of the free world.
How do you think the Ukraine war will end?
Well, today there was some very disturbing news about this Dnipro River dam having been destroyed, or at least damaged to the point that it caused huge flooding. And so it's not a good day. It's another example of the extreme danger of this war, too, because the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is affected by this. Largest power plant in Europe, by the way, a nuclear power plant. And they rely on, for their cooling towers, this very water that's now, flooding all these communities, I think 80-some communities. And the number of people who have died in Ukraine, civilians, because of the Russian attacks, is mounting. It's just it's a horrible example of where the post-World War order is broken down. And in Europe, really the first war in Europe in almost 80 years. So we're not heading in a good direction. How it gets resolved, my hope, of course, is that we stay strong. And I know some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are beginning to wonder, can we continue to support Ukraine? Well, of course we must continue to support Ukraine because it's in our interest as a country. It's in our national security interest that what I talked about earlier, this dichotomy we see out in the global environment, and we're on the side that wins. And if Putin were to win, you would suddenly find 4 additional NATO countries on the border with Russia. So we would be providing a lot of assistance to the Polands of the world and to the Baltics and others, equipment, but also our military personnel. We would be creating Fortress Europe. We would have to. That's not in our interest. That, by the way, is exactly what would be helpful to China right now, would be distracting us from dealing with what's going on in the Indo-Pacific region, because we would be all in dealing with this European disaster. The alternative is we continue to support Ukraine, they fighting on their own, not asking for American soldiers, but asking for the free world to continue to support them, continue to push Russia back, and to have eventually a peace. The peace will only come from victories on the battlefield and tightening of the sanctions. Everyone knows that. And some of my colleagues, I notice, now that I'm gone, I can talk about this freely. No, just kidding. Some of my colleagues are saying, well, we'll get Putin to the bargaining table if we back off. That's not the history here. Not just the history from the 1930s, but the history from today. When you back off with someone like Putin, and Putin in particular, what happens is he takes advantage of that ground. And that cannot happen because, again, it's not just about Ukraine, as important as that is. It's about what will be the future of the world order and what will happen in the rest of Eastern Europe and really on the continent and globally. So I feel really strongly that we must continue what we're doing, and I pray that this summer offensive, which used to be called the spring offensive until last week, now it's summer offensive because it's starting in June.
It may be better actually though with the way the ground is in Ukraine.
And hopefully more equipment has arrived now from the West to give them the opportunity to have the chance to succeed, because the Russians are dug in. So my hope is that they will be successful, and that will get people to the bargaining table, and we can resolve this conflict in a way that preserves Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll open up everyone. You were mentioned on the short list, I think it was in 2012 when Mitt Romney was running for president to be vice president. Have you ever thought about running for president?
So someone asked about the short list once. I said it wasn't that short. Look, I loved serving in Congress, and I guess I did consider it at one point, and maybe it was that year, but others jumped in. I think being
you may be too sensible.
No, not at all. I mean, it's a great honor to serve, but I think it's important. Was important for me and is important going forward to focus on how do you actually pass policy that makes sense. And I feel like my best role was to be in the House and then in the Senate. I was in the administration of both President Bush 41 and 43, which gave me a different insight into both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, which helped in terms of the legislative side. So that's really continues to be my passion.
Why don't we some questions, and we have a microphone in the back, and there's Kimberly right in the middle there. Kimberly Reed, who's the former head of the Export-Import Bank.
Hey, Kimberly.
Good. Nice to see you, sir.
Nice to see you.
And a young leader.
And a young leader and on the board of directors of the American Swiss Foundation here now. Yeah. So I had the honor of working for Senator Portman when he was a lowly congressman on the House Ways and Means Committee. I did oversight, and he loved IRS oversight. I don't know if you remember the acronym TIPIA or TBOR. And then thank you for supporting me when you were senator, when you helped confirm me to be the head of XM, and I visited some great projects in Cincinnati and throughout Ohio. I would just really love, one, your thoughts on, we're going to have Chris Christie announced tonight, Mike Pence announced tomorrow. If you were not running for president, but you were the moderator of a debate of all of these potential candidates, what would be the question that you would really want to see answered, because you're so great on policy, to help us differentiate all of these Republican candidates? And I hope you do run.
Thank you. Well, first of all, we're very proud of you, not just as an alum of the American Swiss Foundation, but of the Ways and Means Committee, on to much better and greater things, and thanks for your work at XM. And by the way, that's incredibly important right now as China continues to use its Belt and Road in countries, third countries all around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, to have us be more aggressive, and XM helps to be able to do that, as do our credit agencies like DFC, So that was a really important job you did, and I know you're continuing to focus on that and be involved. Well, look, if I was the moderator, I would probably focus more on the economic issues. We just went through this harrowing period where inflation exploded, and every family in Ohio and around the country has been feeling it. And people thought that by now, given that the rates went up, that the inflation would start to go down. Well, what's happened? Inflation remains high. People are still hurting. And yet the jobs are coming back, and we have this sort of resiliency in our economy. So the question is, what do you do about that going forward? And my own view, for what it's worth, is that we need pro-growth policies to try to get back to a higher economic growth. And by doing so, we'll begin to get this inflation down. That it was caused, in effect, by a tremendous amount of government spending and the pandemic. So you had both the demand side going up dramatically. This is the $1.9 trillion in the last package, most of which had nothing to do with the pandemic. And then you had at the same time a crimping of the supply chains, which is the recipe for high inflation. So I think that would be my first question would be about, what are your economic plans? One of the things that troubles me sometimes about my own party these days is there's a lot of focus on the past and not enough focus on the future. A lot of focus on grievance and not enough focus on policy. A lot of focus on what was and not what we're going to do for you going forward. And I think, having...
You need to be more like Reagan.
I think Reagan's optimism is really needed, but also, people forget Ronald Reagan had policies. He talked about what he was going to do for people, and then he did it. And I think that was the key to his success. So he did talk about the economy a lot, economic growth, and the American dream that my family from Switzerland experienced, and all of your families have, that's what's ultimately at risk here if we don't, figure out how to focus on those policies and be sure that we are competitive in this global economy. Picking up some ideas from the Swiss is not a bad idea, both in terms of economic growth and the fiscal policies we talked about. But that would be my focus. And when you ask people what the top issue is that they feel, it's always economic. Sometimes it's inflation, sometimes it's jobs, sometimes it's just overall sense of the direction of the country in terms of the economy. But those are the kitchen table issues people care most about.
Okay, one right there in the front.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Paulo von Schirach, Global Policy Institute here in Washington. The biggest existential threat to the United States is China. I hope we agree on that. If not, everything I'm saying is not relevant. That being the case, America doesn't have many friends in this global confrontation. If there should be friends, are the Europeans, right? Who are on our side. Free market economies, democracies, and what have you. What I observe is that many countries in Europe prefer to equivocate on this issue. It's not our problem. This is between America and China, not us. We're not involved. China takes advantage of this by establishing its own bridgeheads, whether it's Serbia, Czech Republic, Greece. The list is long. Where is Switzerland in all this? I'm curious. Maybe the ambassador could address this question too. But I think the Swiss probably understand the gravity of the situation, but one doesn't hear much about the position of Switzerland in this global confrontation. Thank you.
Paolo, great comment and great question, and that is clearly the largest economic and potential military threat. Russia is the immediate threat, and as I said earlier, it's important that Putin not succeed. But ultimately, China is a much more formidable challenger. The ambassador has some views on this that he can express. I know this because I've talked to him about this very issue not long ago. But the Swiss connection to the United States and our economy is so much stronger than it is to China. And I think some of these countries in Europe need to recognize that. Of course, they have...
Switzerland and U.S. is Swiss's number one trading partner.
Yeah. So Switzerland's actually relatively easy in terms of that issue. Exports, particularly from Germany to China, are a significant part of their economic growth. I understand that. But I don't know if Ambassador Peter Lud, you might want to expand on that a little bit. I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, but I'll be very short. Just a few numbers. So the U.S. is our main trading partner as a country. The second one is Germany. The third one is China. But if you take the EU as a trading bloc, I mean, and you put the EU and the US together, China is a dwarf for our economy. So we are not on the lifeline to China. We are not dependent upon the Chinese market to the point other European countries are. And right now, and we were the first country to move into China when Chairman Deng opened China for foreign businesses. So we know China very well. Right now, there is some sort of a movement of yeah, I wouldn't say moving out, but hedging the bets about how the Chinese market is going to move forward. But literally, I mean, it's quite clear we are not dependent upon the Chinese market.
Maybe one more question right there in front. I think we've gone over, and I'm getting the smile from the hook from the back.
Daniel Hansen, LTZF Capital. I'm curious how Switzerland views the situation with Russia in its manufacturing sector. So specifically, they've done some work to get Russian oligarchs sort of out of their banking system, but they've let them continue to be active investors across the manufacturing space, which has left the cost of capital really high. It's caused some of the manufacturing operations to downsize. And you've seen these like great Swiss companies like Oerlikon and Sulzer and so forth have to lay people off because they can't raise capital and can't further their expansion plans because they have these sort of Russian overhangs on them. And I'm curious, how you see kind of Switzerland evolving in that space.
Well, again, probably better directed at Ambassador Peterloo, but one of the comments that I think needs to be made is that the Russian-Swiss economic relationship is minuscule as compared to the EU or the US or even China, for that matter. And so this is one reason I said earlier, I think on the sanctions, more could be done. It's not as if they're reliant, on Russia for their
So you
future
actually think
economy.
the Swiss should increase the sanctions against the Russians?
Well, I think there's some loopholes in the sanctions that can be tightened. And I don't pretend to understand all the issues with regard to manufacturing and the ability for Russian investors to invest, but that might be one. Ambassador, I'm going to turn it over to you again.
Again, I'll try and be very short. I'm not sure, sir, that I understand what you are alluding to because in fact, our manufacturing, let's say, and trade relationship with Russia is indeed minuscule. And so yes, we have an economic presence in Russia. Yes, we do have some factories, and most of them have now ceased their activities for obvious reasons because of the EU sanctions that we are implementing. But let's say that in terms of the trade relationship, Russia is a blip on the radar compared to the real trading partners: U.S., EU, China, and the UK.
Rob, one last question. What is your favorite part of Switzerland?
Oh, gosh. Well, my favorite part is where you hang glide, because Jane and I, paraglide. Is there a difference between hang gliding and paragliding? I guess there is. So Sally Portman was the lightest member of our family at about, I don't know, how old were you, 8 years old? And so we all take off and we're paragliding in the Alps, and Sally went straight up. Like, I lost her. I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. We never see her again. She'll end up somewhere in Italy. So that was spectacular. But look, it's a marvelous country. They love Americans. We have so much in common in terms of our approach to human rights, to values that we all hold dear as to how we respect one another. And they are a free market country. They are a country that values democracy almost in its pure form. We're a representative democracy. We're proud of that. As Switzerland's a little smaller, they can get away with all these referendums and so on. We do in our
get
states.
an envelope in the mail and you can vote on any topic.
But it's such an important partner of ours economically, and as I said, in terms of the foreign policy front, the diplomatic relationship is very important. They can represent us in effect in ways, and when Americans are overseas and stranded in some countries, the Swiss often step forward, and people don't realize it. Mostly, it's just, you know, an important part of our history and their history. There is, you know, lots of stuff that's been written about our Constitution and its formation. The Swiss get short shrift, and they deserve a little more because they did influence it. And, you know, one of the founding fathers was Swiss.
Albert Gallatin, actually,
Our first Secretary of the Treasury.
The statue on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the Treasury Department is Albert Gallatin. Everyone thinks it's Alexander Hamilton. He's on the other side, facing the Washington Monument.
Well, Gallatin was the longest-serving Treasury Secretary ever. He also went on to be one of the founders of Columbia University, and you know, he's an example of someone who influenced us early on and was one of the founders that you don't read about as much. He's not in the Hamilton play, so you know, no one knows about him. Peter Lud, you got to do a better job getting the PR right. Gallatin, yeah.
Actually, the American Swiss Foundation sponsors Gallatin forums in Washington at the ambassadors at the embassy when they're really fabulous events. Senator, really, thank you so much for doing this. We really,
Bob. Thank you, Bob.
And as a token of our appreciation, here are some American Swiss Foundation cufflinks, which are really, they'll be really great for you. And again, anyone either watching or here who would like to be a young leader, we urge you to apply. You just go to our website, americanswissfoundation.org. We also have a speech, by the way, from Justice Scalia talking about the Swiss importance to the founding of the American democracy and the Constitution. And that's also on our website. So I would urge people to look at it. And we really want to thank AEI for sponsoring this great event. And there's so many people here. And again, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for your work every day.
So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much.
Good job.
Thank you.